Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Royal Blue podcast. My name is Joe Thomas. I'm the Echo's Everton FC correspondent. And alongside me, we have my colleague Christopher Beesley and long-time contributor Gavin Buckland. To say that there is a lot to pick over in this episode would be a massive understatement. I think we've got everything to go through, and including, we'll start with the fixtures list, but obviously there's so much that goes on beyond that, from the stadium to the board changes to the Ancelotti stuff to the beginning of the transfer window. I think this is going to be a slightly longer pod than usual, but necessity calls for it. I've been stupid enough to think that Everton might have a few quiet days, a few quiet weeks even this summer, and have booked the last few days off. So I've missed some of the fun and games, although obviously, like everybody, I should think I was glued to my emails and glued to my Twitter and everything on my phone on Wednesday evening as the 48-hour mark passed, and still no word came as to what will be the future of Bill Kenwright and the Everton board. We're still waiting. We're recording this at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. But anyway, Chris, you were on the front line throughout all this, so we'll start with you. Chris, it's been a big week, hasn't it?
Yeah, you just bought another sleepy summer off-season week at Everton, and then everyone's talking about the cricket. I don't think so. Started off, I was just getting my head around reports that Carlo Ancelotti was preparing to sue the club, and then we had the huge announcement of the boardroom exodus on 5 p.m. on Monday evening, like you say.
Absolutely crazy, wasn't it? But so I think what we'll do is we'll start with the fixtures, because we're on Thursday morning now. They've just come out. And then what we'll do is we'll go through one by one, basically how Chris's life unfolded before his eyes across what must have been a horrendous Monday to have been in working without his main colleagues. So fixtures have come out. Gav, I've seen you make some interesting points on Twitter already. What are your first thoughts on what you've seen so far?
About Evans fixtures, well, I mean, there's a couple of Fulham at home's got happy memories. Fulham on the opening day, so it's got happy memories for longest stand Everton fans. I think that was the first game after you won the title in the 63, was it? And also Alan Paul made his debut against Fulham on the opening day in 66. But one of my main points throughout the fixtures, and it's not happened this year, is the first derbies at Anfield. It's always a Goodison. And those people who says it's a random thing, the derbies are always October and March time, aren't they? They're always like sort of late autumn, early spring. And the one that frightens me is, because it just brings back horrendous memories, playing Arsenal in May is just, in away is just, I mean, it's probably happened 5 or 6 times in the Premier League era. We've had a few stonkings in that time, haven't we? So, yeah, that was but the main point which I said on Twitter, which is just my personal opinion, is I just think I just think it's wrong. We play 7 Premier League games in December and then play 7 Premier League games in 2.5 months. And I know there's reasons for that, FA Cup and stuff, but an international break, that just seems to be, it just doesn't work for me, that. And we said it before, the pressure on the players and so on. It's just, we could get to Christmas and the highlight of the season, and everybody's played 6 times in 2.5 weeks. That has to be looked at. And I mean, and some of that to do with the League Cup as well, the way that's scheduled. So, yeah, usual stuff. But Fulham at home, Marco Silva, sunny Goodison. Hopefully, that will be that'll be a good day. And horrendous memories of the game in April, whenever it was.
Yeah, you have the happy memories when it comes to Fulham at home, and I'm thinking, still see it onto my mind, the disappointment of the game in April when, of course, Everton lost 3-1, a game that Marco Silva was in the stands, Alexander Mitrovic was banned, Fulham hadn't won a game in weeks, and Everton had desperately needed to win and put in probably one of their worst performances under Dyche. Chris, last season, you got your shorts out as we went to Aston Villa in the summer sun, and looks like you're going to get the chance to do so again this season.
Yeah, I could be stripping off, couldn't I? I mean, you've done a piece, haven't you, Joe, on the fixtures, and sort of a think piece of what they might be like. It does, in theory, present an encouraging start for Everton in terms of they don't have any of the big six, or they any of the main movers and shakers in the Premier League within that opening month of fixtures. But if we look at them, as we say, Fulham at home, Aston Villa away, Wolves home, Everton took the grand total of 0 points from those corresponding fixtures last season. So perhaps it's not, it does. There's not, they're not games that scare you to death, but we've got to be realistic. Everton are coming into this off the back of the lowest equivalent points total in the club's entire history, a goal away from a first relegation in 72 years. So we don't want to be too negative, but yeah, it does present an opportunity for Everton, but we've got to be realistic, really, about. You imagine some of those other teams might be looking at it and saying, "Oh, we've got Everton early doors. There's a chance to get some points on the board too."
Yeah, I think being realistic is key, and obviously having the context of what's happened in the last 2 seasons is important, like you say there, Chris. But I also think in terms of being realistic, if Everton are a side that want to stay in the Premier League next season, certainly they're a side that wants to try and avoid the anxiety and the frayed nerves that we've had in the last 2 campaigns, where it's gone right down to the wire, then that August and September really does represent an opportunity to get a foothold into the season. Fulham at home, Villa away will be tough, of course, but Fulham at home, Wolves at home, and Sheffield United away, Arsenal at home. Well, Everton have beat them twice in the last 2 seasons in that fixture. Brentford away, tough, of course, but then Luton at home, and then first game of October is Bournemouth at home. Those are as cliched as it is, and Sean Dyche comes out of all the cliches. He come out of the cliche. I'm sure if anybody was in a position where he's on holiday at the minute, I think he's on holiday for most of this month. But if anybody was in a position to ask him, I'm sure he'd say that there are no easy games and every game is a big fixture. But Gav, really, if you want to be making claims to being a mid-table Premier League side, or at least a side that's avoiding a desperate relegation battle, you couldn't really wish for a better start to try and build a bit of momentum up there. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that was the other thing you took from it, that the first 7 or 8 games. We've got a great record against Arsenal at home, full stop, over the last 6 or 7 seasons, bizarrely. And just don't.
Yeah,
we always say this, don't we? I mean, I've been doing the pod 7, 8 years, and you always say, "Oh, they look like a good run of fixtures," and then it never works out like that, and then you get a bad run of fixtures, and you get more points than what you were expecting. So yeah, we'll say it'd be interesting. I think Sheffield United might be a tough game, tougher than what you would expect. And yeah, we'll say. But I think a lot of how we do in the first 7 games is going to depend about probably what we're going to be talking about over the summer.
Yeah, of course.
The new players in and stuff, and what other clubs are doing.
That's the point I've made in my piece on the fixture list. The fact that whilst there's a golden opportunity there for Everton, they've got to avoid the mistake of what of last summer, and that was obviously they didn't replace Richarlison adequately. Then Dominic Calvert-Lewin got injured on the eve of the campaign, so they start the first 5 games of the season without a recognised forward. It was so many of the problems you can date back to that first month, which obviously some of the performances were quite promising. I particularly remember the derby. It was 0-0. It really felt like that was a point before we were kind of fully tuned into the decline that Liverpool had undergone, certainly in the first half of the campaign. That was an entertaining game where Everton had gone toe-to-toe with Liverpool, and I came away from that relatively positively. But you look at the start of the season, they had no striker, they had a crisis in the middle of midfield. It was only James Garner and Idrissa Gueye both went on to play important roles in the season. They arrived on transfer deadline day. Everton didn't win a game until the 7th game of the season when they played West Ham. Transfer window was well gone by that. Chris, they've got to have all their ducks in order, really. And I know it may well be for financial reasons, it may well be a transfer window which Everton have to be reactive. They have to take the opportunities that come their way rather than being able to dictate necessarily to other teams what they're going to do. But they really have to kind of have a bit of clarity going into that first game of the season as to what their strongest lineup is, and hopefully Dyche having had a couple of weeks to work with them.
Yeah, that needs to be the difference, doesn't it? We understand that the funds seem to be tight, and as you say, that's because financial fair play restrictions are still biting. Big transfer issue this summer will be not just who they bring in, is offloading those players who are surplus to requirements. Still got a year on their contract. I'm thinking the midfield trio did the piece about it early in the week, Dele Alli and Jean-Philippe Gamamin and Andre Gomez, of course. So, in terms of bringing them in, they have to do that differently than last year. Obviously, that was the director of football, Kevin Felwell's first summer transfer window last year. He's a chance to establish himself at the club now. Hopefully, identify the kind of targets that he needs to bring in, because they were woefully unprepared for the start of last season, as you mentioned, and it was unfortunate that Dominic Calvert-Lewin got injured, but that was always likely to happen. He's now gone on and have 2 consecutive seasons where he's missed more than half the matches. So you need to have those targets identified and brought into the club and in those key areas. And you'd like to think that a pre-season under Sean Dyche, the infamous Gaffer's Day, and getting them physically ready for the Premier League, that they'd be ready to make that positive start where you can actually get some points on the board early on.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask this question to both of you. Obviously, bearing in mind that we're only really off the back of last season. I, for one, I know there's some international fixtures at the minute, taking place, and I can barely bring myself to even countenance them. But fixture list coming out, were you excited going into 9 o'clock this morning today, Gav? I mean, is this something that kind of, and I know obviously there's a huge amount of issues going on behind the scenes at the club. Obviously, we'll come on to them, but from a kind of, from a broader level, do you get these out and you press the reset button and now all of a sudden you're plotting your way through next season with a bit of excitement? Or is this more of a, oh, bloody hell, I was hoping for a bit longer break before I could really get into the meat and bones of Everton?
At my age, you're excited going into 9 o'clock of every morning, Joe, to go on. I think I'm just trying to get the sight of bees and the shorts out of me head at the moment. So just if you bear with me, I think it's an insight. I think it's a good day, isn't it? It's one of the more enjoyable days where you got dreams, haven't you? You got dreams. You can speculate. What are we, 6th in the table because of alphabetical and stuff, and it's a good way of getting rid of the previous season and looking forward to the next season, isn't it? Really, it's good, and it's all about planning ahead, as you say, and we can all speculate and stuff, and it gets you talking, and I was just thinking that I think that I may be right. Is the last time we played Manchester City at home on Boxing Day of the season, we got in the Champions League, so hopefully that's that's a good omen. But it's a good way of getting into the previous season and what's anything else for me, and looking ahead. And it's always something to look forward to. And I was studying it. My first one is always look when the first derby is. That's okay. Not when it is, but where it is, because I have this thing about it's always at Goodison. So it'd be good to have it at Anfield this year.
Saw someone tweet last night saying that they hadn't seen the fixtures, but they could guarantee that Aston Villa away would be very early in the season, and Newcastle home and away would both be midweek. And I see that they were right on all 3 of those counts. And their only prediction that was wrong was almost the most predictable one in the case of the derbies are normally the other way around. So interesting. Chris, I mean, when you've looked at these fixtures today, what's going through your mind? Are you rolling your eyes at the prospect of 19 away trips with me, or are you getting excited at all the playlists that you can come up with?
Yeah, like I was saying, hopefully it can only be better than our first nine months in a row. And that goes for all Evertonians, doesn't it? It was woefully poor away from home. Well, woefully poor at home as well. Was it 10 home defeats for the first time in the club's history? You've got to hope that it's better. Yeah, you look at those quirks of fixtures. It's interesting what Gav said about the derbies. I guess, although they claim that they're random, they're just not going to pick. You're never going to start a season with a derby, are you, Gav? Or have the last day of the season they got a derby. So I guess they're putting.
I think that one last year is probably the earliest. I think it was one of 2003. It's even going back to the 70s. It was always October, November, February, March. Never did the tail end of the season. mean, there was one at May in 2013 at Anfield, wasn't it? But yeah, I don't want to get too much into it. I think the clubs do make requests. They are allowed requests, aren't they, and stuff, possibly. And it was, Teddy, there was, I bet he could get short odds on being his first game against Man City, couldn't he, though? He said, allegedly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they take it in terms of all that. I mean, like you said, the Newcastle midweek one's a bit naughty because, you know, for a 3-hour trip, it's about, you know, so it's a long one for both sets of fans in that respect. But yeah, we're looking about, obviously, when you go into various places and plotting it, and I think, you know, you're going to go to a certain place when it's sunny again or one in the winter. So yeah, I mean, like you say, it gives chance for everyone to sort of plan their calendar for the year ahead, because a lot of people's lives obviously revolve around where the Blues are any given, I was going to say Saturday, but not always, is it?
No. Boxing Day fixture at home is always a nice one. And I think just a bit disappointed I've got to wait so long to go to Kenilworth Road.
Yeah. Yeah, that's always a good one, though, isn't it? When you have a different ground to go to. I mean, we're just relieved we've not got a lot of new grounds to go to next season. But yeah, it's nice to have something a bit different then, and it'd be you wouldn't want to be. Obviously, they actually put a request in, didn't they, Luton, not to start the season at home because of the work they're having on the ground, but you wouldn't have wanted to have been going there too early in the season, and that's probably why you've got to be a bit apprehensive, like we say about Sheffield United in the first month of the season, going there away from home, because that tends to be when the newly promoted clubs are buoyant and they've still got a bit of the feel-good factor from the previous season. So yeah, interesting times. But yeah, I'm also, like Gav said, wary about that Arsenal on the last day of the season. You certainly want to be in a secure position before going to the Emirates.
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, that's the fixture list done. So that's probably the easy part of today's discussion. So now we will go back to the beginning of the week. Chris, you probably didn't anticipate starting in the way that it did on Monday. We'll go in chronological order, I suppose, is probably best. We'll start with Ancelotti, the Ancelotti news. What can you tell us on this?
Yeah, well, it emerges he's going to the High Court, where he will be suing Everton. And other than that, there's not many details about that one. Obviously, it can't be about him. It's not like he was sacked like Roberto Martinez, who ended up getting over £10 million in an out-of-court settlement with Everton. So his people haven't spoken about that, and Everton haven't spoken about that yet. So other than that, there's not much more we can say about that. And that just proved to be the hors d'oeuvre before the main course at 5 p.m. on Monday.
Yeah, well, there are reports from some outlets that it might relate to tax on a bonus. That's not something that we substantiated. Gav, we'll be short on this because there isn't a huge amount that we can say, but Everton have enough problems anyway, don't they? I mean, the one manager under the Mashiri era that left on his own volition, coming back to Horsham over something like this, is probably something that they weren't expecting, is it?
No, and it goes back to the whole appointment being flawed. As I said on this podcast, it was unusual. It was a management appointment where both parties were out of the depths, and I said that at the time. And the fact that it's rumbled on is not. It's more. You know, people criticise the club over this week, but actually, if it's a point of law or a point of contract in the contract, well, that we'll only find out when the decision's made. And so, I'm just holding my breath on it. But it just points to the fact that both parties were out of the depth, and it was an appointment that should never be made, and it's something that we're still paying for. And I think also as well, regardless of the club's position, it's just bad publicity for the club, isn't it? It's just another unwanted headline that you don't need, and it then gets wrapped up as a package of other unwanted headlines, and then the club has, the reputational damage, either deserved or undeserved, of the club goes even more, and that was my main take on it, really. Regardless of however valid the club thinks their position is, it's just something that they don't need at this moment in time.
Of course, and Chris, I think, I was still trying to work out how to phrase my tweet in relation to the Ancelotti stuff, saying how stupid I was to try and book days off work on the basis that there might actually be some quiet days, when let's be honest, some hugely significant news in Everton's modern history then came out, didn't it, at 5:00 on Monday. I imagine that when it came, you were preparing to finish for the day. Do you want to just talk us through how you found out about what happened, and then obviously we'll get into discussion about its ramifications?
Yeah, Joe's almost goading us there, isn't he? As he speaks about this. Everton seems to have a bit of a penchant for 5 p.m. announcements, don't they? But it arrived, and we knew something big was on the horizon, and it certainly was. Chief Executive Denise Baxendale, Grant Engels, and Graham Sharp all departing the club, and it seemed an inevitability that something like this would happen, but we weren't expecting it quite in one sort of big chunk like that. I suppose at that particular moment, it was poignant that, moments after the final whistle at the Bournemouth game, when Everton's Premier League safety was secured and there was that pitch invasion, there was chance of sack the board, and that had continued from the protests in this calendar year before games. I know that was eventually finished as they tried to get behind the team, but then we subsequently had the protest at the Royal Liver buildings where Everton's offices are, and none of the directors actually attending any of the games of the Sean Dyche era so far, after what they describe as those initial security concerns. So, obviously, throw into the mix Bill Kenwright's public comments, which didn't go down well at all. And obviously, we're still waiting at this point of recording on the chairman's future and the follow-up announcement that the club themselves said was coming within 48 hours. So, yeah, a tumultuous day, and we can just hope that there's now the kind of change that the club so desperately and obviously needs at the top and in terms of its direction.
Well, that's it. I think, listeners to this podcast will likely have seen on the day after the win over Bournemouth, the Echo's front page the next day suggested that, change was necessary. Didn't really go into the specifics as to what change necessary, but it was clear that the current situation was untenable. And I think, you only have to look at just the headline figures. There's huge amounts of losses over recent years, the terrible performances on the pitch, to see that a change of direction, or at the very least new ideas and new inspiration and new innovation is needed at the club. So it felt like something like this was, especially with the MSP, obviously, their investment talks with Fayed and Shiri continuing, and then signing an exclusivity period with the club recently. It certainly felt like something along these lines was inevitable this summer, Gav. We'll part the Bill Kenwright stuff initially. We'll just focus on the three directors that departed or announced their departure on Monday. Were you surprised by this? And if so, what was it you were surprised about? Was it the timing? Was it the fact that all three went? What were your thoughts when you were trying to work out what had gone on?
Yeah, my first thought was the line in the statement that the directors. I mean, about the first thing that surprised me is that Graham Sharp was classed as a director. He is, but he's not he's a non-executive director, and there was no distinction between the three, which is quite illuminating to me about what was Graham Sharp's role then, really, to be fair. Because as a non-executive director, he shouldn't be involved in the decision-making of the club. He can advise and counsel, but he's not part of the operational decision-making. And for him to be included in that group, and also about the work that they've done, that didn't sit right for me from a governance perspective. The other thing was that they've worked very hard towards in the transition period. This wasn't sort of decided on Monday or Tuesday, whenever it was. And I was wondering whether, if this is part of it's been a transition process, why are their replacements not being put in place now? Because obviously there's this laws around how many directors you need, and the club's own articles and that I found that a little bit strange, but perhaps that's going back to some of the stuff you're talking about MSP, and there's a lot of movements around that at the moment, and for a lot of legal reasons, perhaps that can't be done. So that was me. That was the other observation. The final one really is I feel sorry for Grant Ingles in some respects, because we point to losses, but the losses aren't really down to him. They're down to the poor operational decisions that are outside of his control. And yes, you can criticise him for saying, well, he should, as finance director, he should caution people about, you may be causing us financial risk in the future, or even in the present. Don't do it. But ultimately, that is only his voice. That might be heard in the boardroom, but ultimately, I think all that points to is that the decisions around strategy and operational strategy come from Moshiri, don't they? And he's not really going to listen to Grant Ingles. He probably should, but he's not going to, because he's listening to other people. And so I feel a little bit sympathy for Ingles, but it's a scorched earth policy, isn't it, really? You're going to get rid of everybody and start afresh. And that's it. Where it does leave us vulnerable, Joe, is I think in this the hearing or whatever it is over the profits and sustainability stuff, that all the people around during that period who are making decisions and indeed performing the calculations are not going to be there to give evidence or however the hearing works. And there's that probably maybe puts us in a weaker position in that regard. And that's the other area of concern for me. That will come out in the wash.
Yeah, I suppose on the flip side.
Yeah, there's lots of issues there from it, but at the same time, I think the more important stuff's going to happen in the next few weeks, isn't it, about who's going to come in?
Yeah, I guess on the flip side to what you're there saying about the profit and sustainability stuff, if Everton were to have been found in breach of anything, they could perhaps point to the fact that there's been wholesale changes as part of a proactive step to kind of change the regime and change the, people kind of moving forward. But obviously, that all depends on whether they're found guilty of any breach in the first place. And that's a hell of a long way away at the minute. The club vehemently deny any breaches, and they should be deemed innocent until proven otherwise.
It is probably a bit of a clumsy analogy, but it's like a crime's being committed, but the witnesses are not in court. It's sort of like that. That's what I mean. I just think it weakens our position a little bit, but that will come out in time. As you say, to put some of the evidence is as part of the moving forward, we have got rid of the people. We got rid of the people. I get that point as well. But it'll just be interesting to see how that pans out really now, in terms of the key decision makers are not there.
Chris, how important do you think? I mean, Gav's alluded to the transition period already, and we've already spoken about how on the pitch Everton need to make sure that they're in the best possible position to take advantage of what could be a good start to the season fixtures wise. But really, we know how interconnected everything is. Being able to take advantage of it on the pitch is based largely on what's going on behind the scenes at the club. And the transfer window is already open. There's already a few rumours around some of the players. We've already seen some players Everton might have a degree of interest in, go elsewhere or be linked elsewhere. How important is it that any transition that is done is done quickly, and hopefully you would imagine with a degree of forward planning having already taken place before it comes into effect?
Yeah, I think given the number of people who've gone, up to 3 members of the board, and as we say, we're still waiting to see what happens with Mr. Kenwright. You need to actually have somebody in place there. For Moshiri hasn't been to a game for almost 18 months now. He's very much been an absentee landlord. So how much is he actually involved in the day-to-day process of the club? We were led to believe that Denise Barrett-Baxendale, between her and Bill Kenwright, were running the club on a day-to-day basis. We know from last summer when Richarlison was sold to Tottenham Hotspur, Bill Kenwright played a very much a hands-on role in those negotiations with Daniel Levy. So you've got to have somebody there making those decisions, somebody ticking those boxes, making sure everything's running. You can't just have a rudderless ship. So yeah, it's important in that respect. You can't have just nobody running Everton. There's reports today saying that Colin Chong was representing the club at the Premier League meeting yesterday. So yeah, it is important. Obviously, that it could all change very quickly. And that announcement that was made on Monday spoke about the 48-hour time frame, which is now passed, and interim appointments coming in. But so somebody's got to be there in place, and I hope it's not just interim, because you have to have that vision going forward and those ideas being put forward about where Everton are actually going to go next. Because let's be frank about this, there's no margin for error there. They were a goal away from relegation, so both on and off the pitch, things need resolving.
Yeah, I'll stick with you, Chris, on this one. Obviously, you mentioned a couple of times that the 48-hour window. Now, it feels to a large extent pointless to discuss what is going to happen with Bill Kenwright, because we must be on the brink of finding out. Obviously, we're speaking just before midday on Thursday, and the club put the release out saying that there'd be more details on his position within 48 hours of the release that included that claim, and that was obviously 5 o'clock on Monday. So I think, like everybody, in work or not, we were all there at by 5 o'clock on Wednesday thinking, right, it's going to happen. Right, what's the announcement going to be? What is the future of Everton, or the short-term future of Everton? What's it going to look like behind the scenes? Obviously, it didn't come. So, we're in a situation now where 48 hours has turned to well over 60, 65 hours. What does that say to you, Chris? I mean, this is a deadline that wasn't imposed on the club by anyone else. This is the club's own work. This isn't fans, or this isn't the media saying you have an unreasonable expectations. I don't think. We know these things are complicated, but this is a deadline that the club has set up on their own announcement themselves, and they failed to meet their own deadline. I mean, how much does that concern you? How much are you willing to read into that?
Yeah. Using an analogy with the stadium, I know we might move on to that. And the club have been very wary about over-promising and under-delivering when it comes to time frames with that. So they didn't have to do this. It was a big enough announcement in its own right, with these 3 directors going. Obviously, keenly waiting to see what happens with Mr. Kenwright, by far and away the longest-serving football administrator at the club. So they didn't have to do this. Nobody had a gun to their head saying, put 48 hours. They could have put in due course, shortly, whatever, pick your chosen phrase there. So it's not a good look to have any sort of time frame and not meet it, because that throws you open to criticism that you're not being you're not operating effectively, and you're unable to meet your own deadlines, as it were. It's not set in stone, but they put out these words. I mean, not even what we're thinking. If you look at somebody like Phil McNulty, obviously former Echo reporter, now chief football writer at the BBC, he alluded to this. He said that a statement will be made about interim report appointments and the future of the chairman within 48 hours. Said it's no surprise this time frame has passed without a statement. And then he replied to one of your tweets earlier, Joe, saying setting a self-imposed deadline, then failing to stick to it is symptomatic of all the failings that have made change so essential. Just cannot seem to get anything right. So if the figures like this are making statements like that, the club didn't have to do this. They didn't have to use that phrase. So it's concerning that they come out with that and then they don't meet it, because it's like so many things with Everton, even with the appointment of Sean Dyche, we all knew it was done, and you're waiting and it drags on and on. I don't see why they have to do this, especially when they control the situation here. They controlled the narrative. They didn't have to insert this time frame, but when they do miss it, it's not a good look.
No, the tweet that Chris refers to for myself there was last night, just after 9 o'clock. So I waited as long as I could, really, hoping it would just be a couple of hours. I just tweeted that one of the big issues for Everton is that so many of the problems it faces are self-inflicted. The club can't begin to take steps forward if it keeps shooting itself in the foot. And it does not feel that way sometimes. So many of the problems that it ends up facing are ones that it's created out of its own mess. And that's really something that's got to be sorted out, really, I think, over this summer. Everton's got to get itself into a much better position where it can be proactive to the challenges that come rather than have to react to the challenges it creates for itself. Gav, I know that the online world is different to the real world. Of course it is, but there's no point arguing that it isn't a substantial part of the kind of modern day diorama. And the club will be aware of that because obviously they're part of that ecosystem. And it's fair to say that I think even reasonable voices on Twitter, and there are reasonable voices on Twitter, there are lots of very reasonable Everton fans that are very eloquent in voicing their concerns and their frustrations when they come along. We're expressing frustration at this last night. Could you understand why your everyday fan would be frustrated by having, been given that 48-hour time frame to kind of get their head around the substantial changes that are being made in the running of their club that matters that much to them? And then obviously going to bed last night thinking, well, I'm still none the wiser. I mean, can you understand why that frustration would exist?
Yeah, the first statement to say is the problem you've got is some people think that the virtual world of Twitter is real life. That's the bigger issue. But I get all the 48-hour thing. I mean, I suppose the counter to that is that the club said, we'll further announce it in due course. People said, well, when's that? We want change now. We want it immediately, So in some respects, you can't win. But it's just it's a bit like, the non-attendance or the fan advisory board meet the other week where there was bad publicity over people not attending where they just needed to turn up. And I know there's probably reasons why now. And then you got a lot of criticism over that, and it's simple things like that. Yeah, I get that completely. Why people with so much scrutiny and the microscope. I think there's two things. It's just general the scrutiny and the microscope being on the club, and people and fans just want to be updated, want to know what's happening with the chairman, what's happening with any replacements, any interims. We want to know, and I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to be critical of that with the club. It may come out in time why they couldn't do it in 48 hours. To be fair, so I'll defer judgments, but then that goes back to, do you need to give a self-imposed deadline and put yourself under pressure? You don't need to have. But it'll come out the wash, won't it? Really, why? But I can see why people are critical of the club and frustrated, to be honest with you.
And also, it muddies the water, doesn't it? In terms of how this week has unfolded, like we've already discussed, the first day of the release of the fixtures is a time for optimism and hope. We know that it's going to be a difficult summer for Everton. We know the last 2 seasons have been difficult. We know that a lot needs to happen behind the scenes to get Everton in a stronger position, and ready for that August weekend when everything kicks off. But we now have a problem is the hope and optimism that comes with a day such as this is kind of overwhelmed almost by the frustration and the negative feelings towards last night. And that's not to say that people would necessarily have been happy with whatever would have been or whatever is to come from any statement, but you can kind of almost neatly just, if you're looking at it from a PR perspective, obviously, you stick to your 48-hour deadline, which you've imposed, you release the news, and then if it's, whatever news is going to be overshadowed the next day by the fixtures announcements. And there is a degree of gamesmanship within that, but it is a valid way to approach things, and it's a missed opportunity now because you have the opening day of the season. Sorry, I keep calling it that. I mean, the fixtures coming out. And meanwhile, the real thing, the elephant in the room, the one that I think everybody's still thinking about is, well, what's coming out about Bill Kenwright? What's the new statement going to be? And why the club unable to meet their own deadlines? And if this is supposed to be a fresh start of some sort, well, it's a bad beginning to one, because it points to problems that have existed for a long time, rather than any kind of, fresh approach. And, that gives you then hope and cause for belief that things might actually change. We'll draw that element of this discussion to a conclusion there, because I think, for all we are saying about not knowing what is going to come, we know that something is going to come, and I'm sure that will end up making a podcast in itself. So we'll just move on to some of the other things that we've alluded to, and they stem back actually to that fan advisory board, I think, meeting that you referred to just there, Gav, over which again there were frustrations over non-attendance by senior people at Everton, and what that meant in regards to the respect with which they were paying that forum. We found, we had a degree of information come out from one of the last fan group meetings also this week, and it proved quite insightful, Chris, particularly on probably stadium and kits. So do you want to just take us through what we now know, is now in the public domain about Bramley Moore and the move?
Yeah. There was a presentation given about the stadium. The club, for at least 15 months now, have been cautioning that the stadium may not be ready for the opening game of the 2024-25 season. Like all these teams who are in these positions, you don't want to commit to things that you've still got another. They're very pleased with the progress has been made already. The actual concrete ball's complete now. You can see the structure of the roof being taken place. Sorry. It's another winter to get through of construction, and the elements have been kind to Everton, and in that respect, they've not had any major delays because of adverse weather. So, but still another winter to get through. So, we've known for a long time. Well, we've been sort of hinted that it might not be ready for day one, and both you and I, Joe, have been privy to information in recent weeks. It probably looks like you were looking for a mid-season date on 24-25 when Everton might be ready to move in. Now, this presentation sort of, it does back that up into the Everton are saying that there's a chance it won't be ready for the new season, but also there's a dilemma here that rather than moving mid-season, they're open to discussions which might actually put it back to the end of that 24-25 season. So you've actually got the prospect here. I don't know. We still don't know when the keys are going to be handed over. At Lango Rock, we understand they're working to a time frame December 2024. When the stadium might be ready, because as we saw with Tottenham Hotspur, they moved into their new stadium very late. I think they moved in the spring and only played the last 5 games of that season there. So there's actually a prospect that there could be an appetite both with the supporters and people within the club to move it back to the end of that season. But when you're talking about it, say it is ready as we're being told by mid-season, you got the prospect of up to 8 months before actually moving. So that in itself is a dilemma to sort of counterbalance against the dilemma of moving in mid-season. So certainly it looks like this forthcoming season that we just learned about today with the fixtures, it looks unlikely to me that it's going to be the end of Goodison Park. But we're talking about the prospects. It could be another full season there.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously the logistical side of it's really interesting. But I mean, one thing that we do know is this isn't going to be the last pre-season. This isn't going to be the last summer at Goodison, which I think we suspected for quite some time. And it's obviously not going to be, Fulham isn't going to be the first home game of a season that takes place at Goodison Park as well. But around the kind of the idea of the stadium move, could you countenance leaving Goodison midway through a season, or do you think really would you? I mean, this goes into personal preferences. What would you prefer? Would you prefer to get in as soon as you could, or would you prefer, the grand send off and season finale, say goodbye to Goodison, and then the grand opening? Obviously, a lot of this depends on what's going on the pitch. You don't want to end up with ending in relegation at Goodison and then Thursday the Championship at Bramley Moore. But working on the basis that things improve on the pitch for Everton, I mean, do you have a preference over what would happen?
The first thing I'd say is, and this is just a general thing, I don't think clubs should be allowed to move mid-season anyway. I think for the fairness of the league, I don't think you can get a position where some clubs play one team on one ground, and so some clubs play them on another. I think that's the first thing. I personally, mid-1 January doesn't work. You don't really, freezing cold day in January is not the day to launch a stadium. Quite like the idea of what Chris said about Spurs doing, where they did the last couple of games. But I ultimately I'd go with the start of the season. New stadium, new start. I don't know what happened with Spurs. Chris, how would you work with season tickets if you bought the season ticket for one ground and then halfway through the season you move to another ground? How does it? Because one of the things about Bramley Moore is it's going to be more expensive than Goodison. So how do you give people half season tickets and then say we'll renew? You renew them halfway through the season. There's a logistical issue there, isn't there, over what people actually pay if you move ground mid-season and you don't know what date you're going to move. So there's that element to it. And to me, I think just the end of the season, but that there's a logistical issue. But probably my preference is the start of it. Starts the campaign. We all got a vision of going to Bramley Moore, a nice, lovely summer's day like it's been this week, and that's it. It's certainly not in the middle of January, and possibly, March, April, perhaps may not work to a degree for lots of reasons, say logistics. But yeah, for me, start of the season, definitely not going in January.
What about yourself, Chris?
Yeah,
you win the first day in your shorts, don't you?
Yeah, well, maybe get a game, get on, warm up. That'll go down well on it with the public. We have Echo 11 out there for the main event. No, it's tough because as Gav says, we all imagine this idea, and it's the same with all these teams who move and have done over the years, because Everton are coming late to this. Most of their contemporaries who needed a new stadium have made that move already. And I can't remember, other than the Tottenham one, off the top of my head, I don't really recall many of us during a season. Like we say, that one was late. That was the springtime. It wasn't the bleak midwinter. But and I suppose you got to say, on one hand, if the stadium is completed in December 2024, which with a fair wind, it seems that's a realistic expectation as we speak at this moment, 18 months before that. Can you sit on something as expensive as that for 8 months? It's just leave it their way. I know you've got to do all the testing, things like that, but it does seem a long time. If it's ready by then, we all know that the ideal situation is at the start of a season to make the move. But if something is ready halfway through a season, it does seem a long time with the following pre-season just to wait on something like that, and something as expensive as that.
Yeah, right. We're gonna leave all this fresh stuff there for the time being. We're 48 minutes into this podcast, which is normally around the time that we come to stop. But one thing that I'm really painfully aware that I promised for too long already now that hasn't been delivered is the fact that we'll do some kind of discussion on last season. And to be honest, the date on which the new season's fixtures come out is probably a bad time to do this. But I think it's, again, become very, very clear that there's no point waiting for a lull in things at Everton for the hope that there's a spare Monday or Friday when there's nothing newsworthy to talk about. So apologies to everybody that's been waiting for this. I think we all agree it's been too long. But what we'll do now is we'll have 10-15 minutes just discussing last season, and then hopefully we can just put a lid on it. move off away from it and get excited about these new fixtures and where we're going to be and when, obviously, in lieu of whatever the next announcement come from Everton is going to be. So I'm going to just start. I'm going to go to you, Gav, first. We're going to go to the obvious ones first. Who was your player of the season?
Jordan Pickford.
Yeah.
For the reasons he's been our most consistent player this season. There's moments where he's maybe let himself down, but I think he's been kept busy by the Everton defence, as the old joke goes. But that references Pat Jennings when he got the Player of the Year award, Joe, in 1976. His first comment was, "I'd like to thank the Tottenham Hotspur defence for giving me the opportunity to play so well this season." And I think Jordan's probably in the same boat. Jordan, shout out for Seamus Coleman, who was excellent, and shout out for McNeil, certainly after the time when Dyche came in. But for me, the answer's Pickford.
Yeah, Chris, yourself?
Yeah, it has to be Jordan Pickford. Nobody comes close over a full season. As Gav says, Dwight McNeil, along with Abdoulaye Doucouré, certainly picked things up a lot after Dyche's appointment. And he was telling, actually, when I got my calculator out last week and totted up all those average scores for the player ratings, Echo player ratings for the season. After Pickford came top of all the players who played, like 10 or more matches. Over the people who played a couple of games, he had the highest average score. But after him, Seamus Coleman, with a big increase from last season when he struggled 21-22. Seamus Coleman was actually the highest ranked outfield player, second only to Pickford. So yes, Gav alludes to there, yeah. Big returns of form from Seamus, and hopefully that's a new contract for him in the summer, and that'd be richly deserved. But yeah, it has to be Jordan Pickford.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I also think there's a compelling case for Pickford for off the field stuff as well, to a certain extent. Obviously, he's club captain in the absence of Coleman on the pitch. Off the pitch, it sounds like he's quite influential as well. And when you look at, again, he's consistently been very good for a long time, but just like the season before, when things really, really came down to it, he didn't half step up. And you think back to that Maddison penalty save at 2-1 down at the King Power just before half time. Yeah, that is probably one of the biggest saves in Everton's modern history. Because I think Everton are down. If they go 3-1 down, they're not coming back from that. I don't see how Everton survive after that if they lose that game in the manner that they would have then gone on to. And also, I think that it was really significant that he signed a new contract at the back end of January. There'd been a speculation about that for a long time. I think what it did was it after one of the worst for January for Everton must be one of the worst months that a Premier League football club has had this century in terms of kind of off the pitch turmoil and how that seeped onto on the pitch things. And I thought it just gave, because within the release of the outside league contract were comments favourably towards the new management. I thought it just offered a little bit of a boost, a little bit of a shot of credibility to the new regime as it came in, for which I think would have helped Dyche, to be perfectly honest. I know that signing a new contract doesn't mean that Jordan Pickford is going to be with Everton until the end of it, and going into this summer, he is probably, if Everton need to sell in order to buy, well, there is no doubt that some areas of the pitch desperately need strengthening. And of the players that they've got that could probably get a fee that could help strengthen other players, Jordan Pickford is one of them. It's Jordan Pickford and Amadou Onana, really. And obviously, we discussed on this last week, the problem with Begovic leaving means that if Pickford was to be sold, it creates as many problems as it solves. But so we're not saying that Pickford's definitely going to stay by any stretch, although he is happy on Merseyside with Everton. But I did really think that was a really welcome boost at a time when Everton needed it as well. I don't think that should be forgotten. Gav, go on to the next one. What was your lowest point of the season?
I think you just answered it there, really, Joe. I think January was just as a month was dreadful. I think that whole Southampton weekend was probably got worse after that. But I think you'd have to say that whole Southampton weekend I don't think a club has had this, you say about a month. I don't think it has a weekend. You lose to the. Were they bottom of the table then, where Southampton? I think they were.
Came after that and lost to Wolves, who were bottom when they played Everton as well, didn't they?
No, we don't need to go through it. The reputational damage of off the field events. I almost think. I think that's never my lowest point for Everton. I think that was the lowest point of any club during the season, probably. Yeah, I'd go with that. That was just it was just awful.
How about yourself, Chris?
Yeah, we talked about this in our written reviews of the season, but yeah, I'll go for the Newcastle game actually. The Bournemouth doubleheader was horrible. You and I travelling again over 1,000 miles in the space of 4 days to watch those two batterings at the Vitality Stadium. Of course, we've got to remember here we didn't actually pay for that. All those long-suffering Blues who paid hard money in a cost of living crisis, that was even worse for them. But that was pretty grim. People have said in retrospect that's when Lampard should have gone. I think hindsight, the 2020 vision might have been a bit touch early at that point. Although I was fuming about his Carabao Cup selection, but the Newcastle for me, because it was an amazing atmosphere pre-game, the coach welcome. Dead noise coming onto the pitch. Obviously, we talk about Bournemouth being great and all those last day escapes, but I'd never quite even seen anything like that at Goodison Park with the fireworks and all of that. And the fans went the extra mile, but it still wasn't enough. Thoroughly dismantled in the end by a high-flying Newcastle United side, and that was the point when I think a lot of Evertonians thought, well, the Championship's beckoning at this point. So for me, that was the low point.
Yeah, I'd go for Newcastle as well. There were two 30-minute periods which felt very, very similar to me, and the first one was the Brighton at home. That Brighton at home was an absolute. Brighton at home was horrible, and that second half, the way in which it unfolded, the manner of the goals that were conceded, it's clearly the game that. Although he survived for a few more, really that was a game that ended Lampard's tenure. I think that made it untenable that he could carry on. And I just remember the silence. Obviously, we wrote the front page on a couple of days later, calling for the club to be a bit more open about what was going on, about how it was going to get itself out of this mess. And that I thought. It was a difficult time for everyone, but the Brighton one, I just remember the silence and just thinking, you know what, season before Everton stayed up and the fans have been so crucial in leading the way. And there was a slightly it's a strange juxtaposition, but there was almost a feel-good factor at the end of that season when Lampard had kind of managed to unite Finch Farm and the stands, and the fans really did help to carry the players over the line. And I just remember in that Brighton game, look at the silence and the empty seats and the silence from the fans that were remaining there, and just thinking that I'm not sure that this fan base can do that again. I'm not sure it's got the reserves, and hence the piece that followed a few days later saying that I thought it was only fair that those running the club, having had such a warning or 6 months earlier, come out and explain why they deserve the support, because that was the first game where they really started to hear chants of sack the board. And the piece after that wasn't calling for that, but it was basically saying, look, just explain to us what is going on, because we had that January transfer window that was but it already got off to a bad start at that point. Lampard had already confirmed that no one was imminent. Teams around Everton were signing players. Ellis Sims had been brought back, which, obviously he got that goal against Chelsea. He tried hard, and in a more flexible squad that had more opportunity to adapt to his way of playing, he could have had a greater influence. But having had such a warning for so long that they needed striking options, then going to January with Ellis Sims recalling him as their first port of call was, indicative of the problems at the club. And obviously, we now know that over the following weeks, no one else arrived. Obviously, Anthony Gordon left. But despite saying all that, even at Brighton, what Everton still had at that point was time. It was still 4 or 5 months to sort it out, to try and get the points on the board to stay up. After Newcastle, again, the silence and the empty seats was very, very similar. The resignation was there. But by that point, there were 5 or 6 games left. And I think, just like Chris alluded to there, at that point, I don't think I ever believed that Everton, I'm not trying to sound, I don't think I ever could bring myself to believe that Everton were going to go down. But after the Newcastle defeat, I couldn't logically make a case for them staying up. I couldn't say this is where they're going to get the points from in order to survive. If someone had put me on a debating program, I couldn't have made an honest case saying they're going to survive, because all I had going for me was, well, it's Everton and something will work out. And I almost got that sense a little bit with the way in which Pickford saves that penalty, the way in which Hope saves that penalty from Bamford, at a really important time with Leeds 1-0 up in that game, and then going on to just the absolute madness of the win against Brighton, just coming out the blocks. But yeah, I'm with Chris in that. Coming home from that Newcastle game, it just felt similar to the Brighton one, but so many games had been lost in between then, and the options looked exhausted, and it was difficult to see a way forward. So, I mean, we'll go from that to high points of the season. Obviously, there were far fewer than we all would have liked. But Gav, what was your high point of the season?
If you're talking about a game, it's got to be Brighton away, hasn't it? I think. Yeah. Well, that's supposed to be the Corey goal, I suppose, but I think the Brighton away game, I think within that, either of the 2 McNeil goals in different ways. I think the fourth one there, he did well there, didn't he, for the fourth one?
Actually, was he ever tempted to go with his right foot? For that, he wasn't.
Yeah, he probably would have missed. Yeah, but yeah, I think the Brighton away game. I was trying to think about. I don't want to say I'm not conscious of time. Has there ever been a game in Everton's history, certainly since I've been watching them, where we produced the results so out of sync with that whole rest of the season? And the only one I can think of was the very, very first season I watched Everton, which was 1971-72, and we beat Southampton 8-0. And one of the worst teams in Everton history scored 37 goals in 42 games. So we scored more than a fifth of our goals in one match, and it was the biggest first division win of the 1970s, and so that's the only sort of comparison I've got. So Brighton away for me, and extraordinary performance, totally out of sync with everything else.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, there's so few highlights. Again, like Pickford, it has to be, like as Gav said. And in terms of being out of sync, I would say, Gav, Walt Smith's first season, that 5-0 against Middlesbrough, where they'd hardly scored all season at Goodison, and then they put 5 back for it in a midweek. So similar to that. But that's when everything changed. So if we say that Newcastle United was the night that we feared Everton going into the Championship, the Brighton game, the Brighton performance, because not just what it do for Everton, all those relegation rivals, your Leeds United, Leicester Cities, and going back to what Joe said about Jordan Pickford and that penalty save. Oh yeah. I mean, it could have been so different, and the irony was he didn't have to show himself to be England's number one and stretch into the corner. The fact that he just stayed still and saved it. But yeah, that Brighton game, both the performance, the magnitude of it, all Everton's relegation rivals, they'd have watched that with horror. They're saying, where did they pull that one out of the bag from? We're not going to do anything like that. Yeah, where did it come from? Those amazing goals. Just the performance, and it was a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of the relegation battle, because you went from fearing where Everton going to get the results from, they're heading for the Championship, to they dare not go down after this result, just flipped it totally around, and Everton were suddenly in a position where they dare not throw that away, and that it would have been such a tragedy if they'd have achieved that Brighton result and then not stayed up.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, you two go for Brighton. My high point of the season, I go for far earlier than that. And I go for the Crystal Palace win, the 3-0 win, because I just thought almost everything that came after that was tinged with the context of it being a relegation battle and the threat of the Championship, as opposed to whenever, that game, the sun was shining. Dominic Calvert-Lewin was back. He scored that wonderful opening goal. You had Mikalenko bursting forwards. All of a sudden, the fullbacks were creating a threat. And Gordon got on the score sheet. Dwight McNeil did as well. All the goals were great. The way in which Everton played was great. There was just everything that you'd have wanted from that game. And it just felt at that point where after a slow start, obviously Everton had to the season, they picked up that win against West Ham. They'd gone and got a reasonable point at Fulham, who were on good form at the time. I think that came after the Palace game, sorry. But at that point, there still felt hope for the season that we were in. I thought it felt like maybe what Lampard was working towards with Everton, Lampard and Felwell, they were just starting to kind of make some steps towards that. New players were settling in. Let's say Dominic Calvert-Lewin was back. Everton had beaten a decent side by playing good football. And, that was the kind of almost the trajectory that took us almost up to that, right up to that week with the Bournemouth games where, I still kind of point to this when people say about Lampard should have been sacked at the end of that week, when that week started with the bonfire night game against Leicester. And albeit there were warning signs there, Amadou Onana got pushed further forward. It really didn't work. Lampard came out and praised the performance, which I thought was pretty poor. I thought, although it took an absolutely wonderful strike from Yuri Tillemans to open the score, and Leicester had dominated that game. They really had made a mockery of Everton in it. But before that game, I remember being in the press box at bonfire night, and we were all sitting there thinking, if Everton win this evening fixture, they go into the top half. And, you're just there thinking, oh, will it be like, top half, maybe go and get points at Bournemouth, spend Christmas floating around, 10th to 12th, then going into a January transfer window where surely they'll now get a striker. And everything just felt like it was on a positive trajectory there. And I think, you go back to that beginning of the season, you just had there's this nice idea of the lads there, Frank Lampard and Connor Cody and James Tarkowski, the dads, these nice, positive personalities that you kind of want to like, being an Everton side that could play good football, or was on its way to playing good football, getting good results, and being a likeable Everton side with it. Obviously, we all know what that unfolded, and it couldn't have really gone any worse, with the exception of obviously Everton didn't ultimately go down. But I just think that anything that the Brighton game was obviously hugely significant, but everything that came after, certainly after the World Cup break, was tinged with the kind of the veneer, the negative veneer of what had gone on before, and the prospect of a relegation battle, whereas there was almost more innocence and more hope in the joy of that coming home from that Palace win. So for me, that's the high point. Gav, who were you most pleasantly surprised with this season? Is there a player that you perhaps snuck under the radar a little bit that you weren't expecting to like, and you were actually really pleased with how they did?
I think ultimately, not over the season, but I think McNeil's form in the second half of the season, a bit like another winger that we bought from Burnley, Trevor Stephen, in his first season. He really struggled before Christmas, but he really struggled till the end of March, really, and then pulled it out in the last couple of months. McNeil, very pleasantly surprised of that change in form. Really, I did coincide with Dyche coming in maybe, but yeah, looked a completely different player, and at the end of the season was probably a far better player than what I thought he was, and I'm probably not alone with that. So yeah, Dwight McNeil for me, and let's hope he can continue it, because he's still a relatively young lad, isn't he? What is he, 22, 23, something like that, maybe? Yeah. So McNeil, with hopefully more to come.
Chris?
Yeah, as we know, we're boring, but yeah, it has to be. But in terms of the transfer recruits, it was the kind of McNeil we were hoping to see when they paid 20 million to Burnley for him. Still a lot of question marks over the players they brought in. Amadou Onana remains one of, like we said, along with Pickford, one of those two saleable assets for big money, because you could potentially still make a profit on them despite a very average first season. And, he got great potential. but hasn't really showed that to the extent you'd like to. Vinagre hardly got a kick. Connor Cody looked inspired, but then with a change of manager, that one didn't work out how we'd have thought. Or Neil Maupay wasn't played to his strengths whatsoever and ended up being like a huge flop, 1 goal in 29 games. James Tarkowski was a free transfer. So Idrissa Gueye kept them waiting until the end of the window, and then a lot of the time wasn't like his former self. James Garner, hopefully there's more to come from him, promising games towards the end of the season. But yeah, because there's so many question marks over the other signings, it was nice to see McNeil finally sort of delivering those kind of performances we'd always hope from him.
I think for myself, probably there was a lot of hope around James Garner. It took so long for us to see anything from him, mainly because of obviously he didn't really have a pre-season, and then he suffered that difficult back injury around the Bournemouth week that ruled him out for well into this year. But once we finally did see him, I was really impressed with James Garner. Obviously, I mean, McNeil is certainly up there with this, but I was just really encouraged by what I saw from James Garner in the final weeks of the campaign. And obviously, his own versatility played against him. He was played out of position in wider midfield and played at fullback. But I thought he took to those tasks pretty well. But just in centre midfield, I thought he had a tidy game. He's probably the one player to come out of the Fulham defeat with a degree of positivity. It was his first start for Everton. I thought he'd done a tidy job. I liked him at Crystal Palace and that as well. So I'm going to go that, I mean, surprise isn't quite the best way to do it, but I was probably most encouraged by him and what he will hopefully bring, because he made himself pivotal to what Dyche had left, I think, in the final weeks of the season. And it's going to be that midfield's going to be a really interesting one going into next season, I think, because you obviously Abdoulaye Doucouré has proved so important for Dyche. You think he's in there, and he kind of almost. You have Idrissa Gueye, and he has had a bit of a roller coaster of a season. Certainly, I mean, the back pass to Pascal Gross's goal against Brighton still fills me with terror. And there have been a few others that he's got away with this season that have been a bit like that, almost like a no-look back pass on the halfway line, expecting a centre-back that wasn't there or wasn't quite where he thought he would. But you wonder if him as a senior pro might also line up in Dyche's first choice 11. So that battle between James Garner and Amadou Onana could be an interesting one for a starting lineup. That's if we get to see it play out, of course, because as we've already mentioned, Amadou Onana is an asset that may well be a route into getting some kind of transfer funds for Everton this summer. So that's going to be a really interesting one. I liked what I saw of James Garner. Hopefully we see a lot more of him next season. And what happens with Onana is obviously going to be key to that. Chris, I'll stick to you just for this last one. I mean, obviously we've travelled the length of the country several times going to watch Everton, and you were right to kind of always pay tribute to the supporters who did that so many times despite what they were seeing and having to fund it themselves. I mean, were there any kind of moments that stick out for you this season from all the games that we've been to, either positively or negatively? Is there anything
moments that stick out for? Other than obviously that crazy great evening in Brighton, it was just from a high point, and then when it was relatively early in the season, that 1st of October, the comeback win at Southampton. We thought, yeah, there we go, new regime. The boys on tour there. It's going to be a good one. So there was that, but yeah, on the flip side of it, the Bournemouth one, because no disrespect to Bournemouth, they did great this season and got themselves safe before the end, and for them that's terrific. But the humiliation of a club like Everton, and like as Gav has said, nobody has a divine right to be in this division, and if you run badly, you'll struggle. Certainly, you're not one of the big six. But yeah, getting turned over twice in emphatic fashion by them. First, their second string beat Everton's second string after Lampard made 11 changes. And, that set the tone, whatever he said, for what went on a Saturday when all the regulars came back. And even Pickford, who was player of the season, I've got to remember, he 3-1 on at Bournemouth. That was like one of his low points as well. And the whole stuff with the fans at the end. So yeah, that sticks out for all the wrong reasons. That double trip to Bournemouth, but I guess in the end we're just thankful we'll be going back there again next season to the Premier League. I was going to say the Premier League's smallest venue, but it's not now, is it? That's Luton.
I think well, it was overshadowed by so much of what came after it. But one of the grim ones was that week where we went to Tottenham away on the Saturday and Newcastle away in midweek. But both those long trips for 2 games, Everton lost and didn't muster a single shot on target across 180 minutes. I mean, that was the least of the worries now when you look at everything else. But that felt so grim at the time. But I think the thing just sticks with me, is obviously we've alluded to them so far already, but just the way that away end just kept full, and they sold every ticket that was available to them over the course of the season, despite having 2 consecutive campaigns of dismal away form. The way in which they carried on supporting their side, regardless of what was going on the pitch, off the pitch. It really was phenomenal. You look at some of them scenes, they were excellent. So again, away at Leicester, like they were so memorably the season before, but Brighton, the atmosphere there was just absolutely phenomenal, and it was great that they finally got the performance and the result, the celebration that they deserved on that fixture. And then even Wolves, a couple of weeks later, again, the way they filled out that end was just like fair play to them. I think we probably just keep our fingers crossed that they get served up something a little bit better next season. So yeah. Anyway, we'll bring that to an end now. Obviously, we'd probably got into the last season in a bit more depth if we'd have done this at a more appropriate time. We haven't. That's our fault. I'm sorry. But I don't think there's going to be any shortage of discussion points for the podcast coming up. So obviously, this is Thursday lunchtime, and just to reiterate, we've not heard anything more from the club in relation to further board announcements or changes at the top level. When they're going to come is anybody's guess. But when they do, I'm sure that they'll probably spark the next podcast. So just because one's come out on a Thursday, don't anticipate one's not going to come out tomorrow, because we may well have plenty of reason to do so. So anyway, look, thanks so much for joining us. It's a longer podcast today. If you sucked all the way through to the end, then I applaud your stamina. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to you tuning in again soon.